Today, Friday 17th May, we are in a good position to start to assess the outcome, the results of the meeting, the visit by President Putin to Beijing, and his meeting there with President Xi Jinping and other Chinese leaders. I will come to that later in this program, but first, as I traditionally do, I'm going to turn to a discussion of the situation in Ukraine, the latest events on the battlefield, and some diplomatic moves, which, as is always the way, now point from the Western side into diametrically opposite directions. Let's start with the situation on the battlefield. And the first thing we must do is that we must first discuss a indisputable Ukrainian success, the first one the Ukrainians have had for a long time now, and the first success of the ATACMS system in this conflict. Now, I've discussed in several programs now that Ukraine has been launching large numbers of ATACMS missiles towards Russia, and specifically and principally towards Crimea. And the Russians, up to this time, appear to have had no difficulty in shooting them down. They've been shooting down ATACMS missiles in significant numbers, and so far, these missiles have not managed to do any significant damage on Russian facilities. Well, about 2 days ago, that changed. Now, that was the day, as I recall, when the Russian Defense Ministry reported that they'd shot down 10 ATACMS missiles. What they didn't report, and what they never report, is that even though they may have shot down 10 ATACMS missiles, one or perhaps two did manage to get through and strike the Belbek air base, located near the sea, located near the coast, very close to the coast, in fact, on the southern part of Crimea. Most reports seem to think that it was one missile that got through, and the damage appears to have been done in a relatively small area, but one packed with important targets. So an S-400 missile system, presumably the S-400 missile system defending the base, and possibly the S-400 missile system that shot down most of those other 10 missiles. Anyway, that missile system was destroyed. Several other aircraft were damaged or destroyed as well. And critically, 2 MiG-31 fighter jets were also destroyed. Now, the MiG-31 fighter jet is one of the most important and most powerful fighter jets deployed by Russia in the area of the special military operation. It has an enormous electronically scanned radar. In fact, it was the first such radar to be installed on a fighter jet, and caused, as I remember, astonishment and some alarm in the West when it first appeared in the 1980s. It is capable of launching extremely long-range missiles. The R-37M missile has apparently been doing the greatest amount of damage on against Ukrainian fighter jets. It's a very long-range air-to-air missile, which the Russians have been launching, it seems, principally from their MiG-31s. And also, the MiG-31 is the carrier aircraft for the Kinzhal hypersonic missile that is launched against ground targets. Now, not all MiG-31s are adapted to launch Kinzhals, and I understand and suspect that the two aircraft at Belbek, the two MiG-31s, were not amongst those that are equipped to launch to launch Kinzhals. However, these are very important air assets indeed, and I think there's going to be a lot of concern in Russia about this incident, if only because the MiG-31 is no longer in production. In fact, as I understand it, production ended in the 1990s. It's probably impractical now to resume production. And besides, the Russians are supposed to be working on its eventual successor, an aircraft which is regularly referred to in the Russian media as the MiG-41, though we don't know that that is going to be its actual designation if and when it appears. But anyway, the MiG-31, critically important aircraft, though it is not in production. Russia has roughly 150 of these, I believe, in service. There's apparently a significant number held back in reserve, but they would take a great deal of work to bring back up to standard, to the situation where they could be used, they could be operated again, if that is even possible at all. And, well, one way or the other, the Russians can't realistically afford to lose MiG-31s. Now, I believe I'm right in saying that these are the first MiG-31s that the Russians have lost over the period of the special military operation. And inevitably, there will be lots of questions in Russia as to why this has happened. Firstly, why were two very long-range aircraft deployed to such an airbase close to the sea on the western tip of Crimea, in a position where it would be vulnerable to missile strikes launched from Ukraine? It would logically, the MiG-31 most certainly does have the range to operate from air bases further east, and given that Russia does have a certain number of these aircraft, one would assume that the Russians could maintain air patrols over the Black Sea, even the western Black Sea, from bases in, say, Krasnodar region, without having to deploy these aircraft at Belbek. And besides, there's this perennial issue about why no hardened air shelters have been housed to protect these aircraft, given the fact that the Ukrainians are clearly trying to target Russian air bases. And as to the last question, I really have no simple explanation. There have been many strikes by the Ukrainians on Russian air bases at various points over the course of the special military operation. Whenever that happens, the cry goes up, build hardened air shelters to protect the aircraft from these kind of attacks. It's widely assumed that had there been hardened air shelters and had the MiG-31s been housed in such shelters, then the damage caused by this probably single ATACMS that got through would have been much less. And despite this, despite claims and criticisms and demands for this to be done, going all the way back to the summer of 2022, it has not happened. Now, all kinds of explanations have been floated. It's been suggested that materials are in short supply and that it'd be a huge operation to build enough of these hardened air shelters to make a significant difference. But we saw over the course of the winter of 2022-2023 that the Russians were able to construct the massive Surovikin line right across their front lines, which required huge amounts of material to complete. So I don't actually buy this theory that the problems are caused by lack of materials or lack of building and construction workers or any of those things. I think much more likely we're looking at the usual bureaucratic inertia. Probably there's all kinds of complex procedures about required in terms of building bases and building facilities at bases. And unless my own experience of having worked close to government, in Britain especially, is that unless someone in full authority takes charge of something, usually these bureaucratic obstacles, or these sort of bureaucratic obstacles, which can be extremely annoying, can become insurmountable. But anyway, one way or the other, it's clear that it wasn't done. Now, I wonder whether the new Defence Minister, Igor Belousov, who's now just come in and has taken over, once he's reviewed this affair, he will finally take the step of authorising the further building of these hardened air shelters. Now, I am going to make one point. Ukraine has, by my calculations, if Russian reports are true, the reports from the Russian Defense Ministry are true, anyway, it appears to have launched somewhere around 40 ATACMS missiles since it received its delivery in March. I am not sure how many ATACMS missiles were delivered, but the speculation is that it was around 100. So a very significant number of these missiles have now been launched, and so far the amount of damage done has been limited basically to this one incident. The attacks on the Jankoy air base, the attack does not seem to have been successful. In this case, the attack was successful because one particular missile got through. It looks as if the S-400 system that was defending Belbek basically simply got overwhelmed. And inevitably, in a war, one does expect from time to time a missile to get through. There is no such thing, as has been pointed out to me many times, as a 100% totally foolproof air defense system. And the fact that one ATACMS has got through is not a sign of a failure of the air defense system, the Russian air defense system, or the success of the ATACMS. It is just what happens in war. So I don't think this changes the overall strategic reality about the ATACMS, the fact that so far its performance has been distinctly underwhelming. What it does is tell us that there are still fundamental issues which have not been resolved about the proper handling and arrangement of Russian bases. And, well, as I said, one wonders whether the new broom at the Defense Ministry, Andrei Belousov and his team, whether they will finally get round to doing things that will make a difference. Now, the Ukrainians followed up this attack on Belbek with a simply gigantic attempted drone strike on Crimea, and they also launched water drones against Crimea as well. doing so for some mysterious reason in broad daylight. The Russians seem to have made short work of the water drones, and as I understand it, none of the airborne drones managed to get through. So far at least, the Ukrainians have not been able to capitalize on this incident. If the Russians respond to it by finally hardening their bases, which of course is well within their capacity, then I think that this will probably be an isolated incident in which only a significant, but hardly critical, amount of damage has been done. If the Russians do nothing, as they have done up to this point, to harden their bases, their air bases, then I'm afraid they must expect more incidents of this kind, because, as I said, sooner or later, a missile will always get through. I suspect, if we're talking about Crimea, that with the Ukrainians making threats to destroy the Crimean bridge, and with the Crimean bridge, for all that it has lost its logistical significance, is still something of a symbol, both for the Ukrainians and the Russians, and increasingly for the West as well. I suspect that the Russians have concentrated many of their air assets in Crimea on the pathway leading to the Crimean bridge, which is probably why Belbek was less protected with fewer air defense missile systems than perhaps it ought to have been. I don't think that will change. The Russians are still producing more and more air defense systems. I suspect they'll have little difficulty in replacing the one that was destroyed. But as I said, they do need to start taking steps, finally, to do that which they have not done, which is harden their bases. Anyway, in all other respects, the news for Ukraine along the battlefronts remains bad. Now, the Ukrainians over the last couple of days began to claim that the Russian advance in Kharkov region has been slowed down. Over the last 24 hours, I noticed that they've adjusted their rhetoric again, and they are once more talking about a crisis in Kharkov region. Before I go on to what's actually happening in Kharkov region and to what the Ukrainians are saying, it's perhaps important to mention, in fact, it's essential to mention, what the most important Russian of all, President Putin, is saying about the Kharkov operation. He's just been speaking, just literally moments before I started making this program. He's been speaking to students and teachers at the Harbin Institute of Technology in China, and he was asked about the situation in Kharkov region, and he was also asked about whether the Russians have any plans to capture the city of Kharkov. And Putin denied it. He said that for the moment, the Russians have no plans to capture Kharkov city. Now, I don't yet have the full words of what Putin said, but he said that he appears to have said that as for Kharkov, no, we have no plans to capture that city right now. The Russians have been provoked, according to Putin, to take the step that they did because of the repeated Ukrainian attacks on Belgorod, and that they're, for the moment at least, in the process of creating a buffer zone. And he also said that the Russians do have an overall plan for the conduct of the campaign in Ukraine. Of course, he said that previously in those meetings with the army officers and the officials of the military-industrial complex that I discussed in yesterday's video. Anyway, he said that they do have an overall plan and that that plan is being successfully executed. But for the moment, at least, the Russians are not planning to capture Kharkov. However, note that this is a qualified statement. These appear to be Putin's exact words about Kharkov. As for Kharkov, no, we have no plans to capture that city right now. So that does appear to leave open the possibility that the Russians might decide to capture Kharkov eventually. So just say they're reoccupying the positions around Kharkov which they withdrew from in the autumn of 2022. And even according to Putin, one day, possibly, maybe, they might decide to return and to try to take Kharkov as well. But that is not for the moment their plan. And in fact, we just seen more reports. They're shooting directly at the center of the city. This is apparently Putin's words. The city clearly is Belgorod. As I said publicly, that if this continues, we will be forced to create a security zone, a sanitary zone. And that's what Putin says the Russian military are currently doing. I come back to a point, by the way, I made some days ago, which is that we're now seeing the results of Budanov's activities on the Russian-Ukrainian border. His incursions, the incursions he organized into Belgorod region, all they have done is provoke the Russians to advance into Ukraine, operate more Ukrainian territory, and reactivate a theatre, the Kharkov theatre, from which the Russians had withdrawn back in the autumn of 2022, and which it was overwhelmingly in the interests of the Ukrainians to keep quiet. Ukraine is, at this moment in time, paying the price of Kirill Budanov and his James Bond activities. And, of course, the James Bond activities Budanov has been encouraged to undertake by his Western sponsors. Will that result in Budanov's dismissal or resignation? Of course not. Will that cause him to change his approach? And will that cause his Western sponsors to lose faith in him? Of course not. But it's worth saying. Anyway, let's talk about the situation elsewhere on the battlefronts. And let's, in fact, start with Kharkov. We now know from Putin that as many people, including myself, by the way, suspected, for the moment, the Russians do not have an objective of trying to capture Kharkov. The forces that they have concentrated on the border, 55,000 by most accounts, are insufficient to do that. Well, we have received quite a lot of reports over the last 24 hours, and they do not point to a slowdown in the pace of Russian military operations in the Kharkiv region. What they do point to is the fact that the Russians are no longer advancing as rapidly as they previously were. But, of course, if their intention is to create a sanitary zone, a security buffer around Belgorod, then there's a limit to how far, anyway, they're probably likely to advance. But they do clearly have two places in their sights, Lipsy and Vovchansk, and it looks like they are determined to capture both. Now, From what I understand, the Russians are now very close to what is often referred to as an operational encirclement of Lipsy. An operational encirclement is one where the Russians are not necessarily haven't necessarily fully surrounded a place and trapped Ukrainian troops inside it. It isn't a cauldron or a siege exactly, but it's one where the Russians are located on three sides of a particular location and where they can shell and bomb and launch drone strikes on the supply lines leading into that location. And that seems to be where we are with the fight for Lipsy. This is a developing battle, and there's some speculation as to exactly where the Russians, what directions the Russians are going to attack towards, but they do seem to be working towards achieving this kind of operational encirclement of Lipsy, and it is now universally acknowledged that they have entered this rather large village, and that a storming operation for this village is now underway. General Syrsky, by the way, the overall Ukrainian commander, is now saying that the Russians are operating behind the Ukrainians in some, the rear of the Ukrainians in some areas, and it may very well be that what he's referring to is this Russian operation to gradually surround Lipsy. But it could also be that he's talking about other places too. Chasiv Yar, which we'll come to shortly, is another possibility. So anyway, the Russians are now clearly storming Lipsy, and there's some reports, by the way, that they've captured another village in the area of Lipsy, though the Russian Defense Ministry is remaining very silent and very quiet about this. In the other part of Kharkov region, the Russians also seem to be in the process of completing the capture of the northern part of Vovchansk. This is the part of Vovchansk which is north of the Volga River. And there's been apparently intense fighting in this area, and shelling and bombing by the Russian Air Force has been tremendous. And I've seen some pictures of the enormous amount of damage done to this part of the town. But anyway, it looks as if the Russians have either completed or are very close to completing their operation in this part of Vovchansk. It also seems that the Russians have crossed the river, the Volga River, somewhere to the east of Vovchansk itself, and that Russian forces may have entered Vovchansk from the east. This is the southern part of Vovchansk. I've, by the way, seen film now of the Volga River. It's clearly a small river. It's quite clear to me that soldiers can wade across it without much difficulty. And I suspect that tanks and armoured vehicles could probably wade across it also. It doesn't look to me like the kind of river that would form very much of an obstacle. Just saying. As I think I've said in the past, I have been a walker. In fact, I still very much enjoy walking in the countryside. I would not assess the Volga River from the pictures that I have seen of it as a particularly significant obstacle. Obviously, if there are Ukrainian troops located on the bank where one is trying to cross the river, then whilst crossing the river, one would be exposed, very exposed, to shooting by those Ukrainian troops. But I suspect that there are lots of places along the river where the Russians could cross if they are able to control many of the banks. I doubt that the Ukrainians would be able to patrol every single part of this river, even with drones. And an operation to cross the river, which would enforce, which would probably anyway be done at night, I suspect would be fairly effective. Anyway, one way or the other, I have no doubt that the Russians will capture Vovchansk. It may take them some time. I'm not going to try and guess how long, but that battle at least is underway, and the Russians seem to be well on the way to capturing most of the town, which apparently lies north of the river anyway. Now, I read a report somewhere, this is from the Russian side, probably on Slavyangrad, that the Ukrainians have rushed so many reinforcements to try to hold Vovchansk. These are bits and bobs of battalions taken from many different units across the front lines, that these units have been crammed, these Ukrainian units have been crammed into Vovchansk, and that they have inadequate cover because there's no proper fortifications in the town, and that it's in fact relatively easy for the Russian artillery and Russian drone operators to carry out massive destruction on Ukrainian troops in Vovchansk. And I've just remembered, by the way, that I read this not on Slavyangrad, I read this in Redovka, this Russian newspaper based in Smolensk. Anyway, so the Ukrainians have in effect concentrated too big a force, too big and too disparate a force in Vovchansk for the territory, that the Ukrainian troops in Vovchansk are interfering with each other, that there's no properly organized plan of defense, and that in the absence of proper fortified positions in the town, this is turning into something of a massacre, that the Russians are able to do terrible damage to the Ukrainian military through their shelling and bombing of the Ukrainian troops in Vovchansk. And they also apparently have fire control of all of the main supply roads leading into Vovchansk. So armored vehicles and other vehicles that try to reach Vovchansk along these roads are being systematically destroyed, and being destroyed in very large numbers. And the same apparently is true of Ukrainian artillery positions. When the Ukrainians establish artillery positions in and around Vovchansk, the Russians are able to destroy them as well. And I noticed that the military summary channel says that the Russians have now redeployed from Zaporozhye region one of their most experienced units that operate FPV drones to the Vovchansk area. And I suspect that that is the reason that this opportunity to inflict as much damage as possible on the Ukrainian army in Vovchansk and to destroy as many artillery pieces and armored vehicles in the Vovchansk area as possible. That this is an opportunity that the Russian military feels it cannot pass over, and that is why this unit of highly experienced and very professional drone operators has been brought to Vovchansk. So it's turning into another appalling disaster. Anyway, quite plausibly, it is the effect of these drones and FPV drones and Lancer drones and all of these, plus the enormous effect of the Russian shelling and of the aerial bombs, which is the reason why Zelensky is pleading for 2 Patriot air defense missile systems to be sent to the Kharkov area. All I would say is, if the United States and the Europeans are foolish enough to supply these Patriot missile systems to Zelensky and to Ukraine, and if they are indeed deployed to precisely this area, then I think that the Russians will be entirely delighted. It's apparently all but impossible to conceal equipment in this area. The topography doesn't allow for it. And these systems, expensive, enormously expensive systems, would very quickly be destroyed as well. Just saying. So anyway, there we are. A Kharkov operation, which continues. The Russians close to achieving operational encirclement of Lipsy, apparently in control of a significant part of Vovchansk, likely to be in control before very long of all of Vovchansk, and doing very severe damage to the Ukrainians in and around Vovchansk. I would add that when it comes to armoured vehicles, it's now fairly clear, I think to most people, that Ukraine is very short now of armoured vehicles, that their numbers of tanks and infantry fighting vehicles has become significantly reduced, and they really cannot afford to lose them in the quantities that they're losing them in the Vovchansk area at the present time. Anyway, that's the situation in the Kharkov front. Now, the other 2 main battlefronts are Chasiv Yar and Avdiivka, the Avdiivka Ocheretino area. But before I discuss those, I will say that there was something else that was mentioned in the very latest Russian Defense Ministry update, which I found rather intriguing. The Russian Defense Ministry reported for the first time, I think, in a long time, Russian military operations close to the town that they refer to as Krasny Liman, in other words, Liman. And of course, the Russians withdrew from Liman quite a long time ago, in the autumn of 2022. And I haven't seen Krasny Liman referred to in that way for quite a long time. So I have to say, I do wonder quite what that means, and I'm not entirely sure exactly where this operation involving Liman, Krasny Liman, is supposed to have taken place. So it's intriguing, but I wonder if it's the first hint that some kind of operation involving Liman might be underway before very long, whether the Russians do intend to reactivate some kind of operation in the Liman area close to Slavyansk. Anyway, just saying. If we go back to the situation in Chasiv Yar, many reports now that the Russians are not only fighting inside the micro-district, but that they have encircled it, that the Ukrainian defenders of the micro-district are in effect trapped. There's also multiple reports that the Russian forces north of Chasiv Yar are coming very close to the canal, and that they are very close also, and perhaps have even entered and are in the process of seeking to capture the village of Kalinina, which lies immediately to the southwest of Bogdanovka, which the Russians captured some time ago. If the Russians capture Kalinina, they will have control of the heights north of Chasiv Yar, and they will be able to cross the canal in the north, even as they are now securely positioned to cross Chasiv Yar to the south, and they can attack Chasiv Yar from two sides, and it will be a disaster for the Ukrainians, one which could result in the loss very quickly of Chasiv Yar. In fact, I'm going to suggest that it's likely that the battle of Chasiv Yar is, well, it's not close to its end, but the main part of the battle, the one of the storming operation, the one involving the storming operation, is probably not that far away. Anyway, meanwhile, we continue to get information that the Russians are now close to capturing other places in the Avdiivka or Cheretino area. And today, in fact, just a few hours ago, a spokesman for the Donetsk People's Republic has confirmed that Ukrainian defenses in Netailovo have now collapsed, and it looks as if the Russians are likely to capture this village, this important strategic village, south of Umansk, just west of Pervomaisky, that they're likely to capture this village very soon. And we were told units of several Ukrainian army brigades were concentrated in Netailovo. There were a lot of mobilized assault fighters, and it could be seen in some places that they had no experience at all. They abandoned positions gradually, with some of them doing it quicker, while some others are still putting up resistance. As a result, they have left most of their positions, just fleeing in some places. So it looks as if Netailovo is indeed about to fall. As I said, there were reports yesterday that it had already fallen, but it seems as if Ukrainian resistance in Netailovo is about to collapse. And if Netailovo collapses, with Umansk captured, Yasnobrodovka will fall, and the villages immediately to the north of these places, where the Ukrainians are still resisting, like Sokol and others, the Ukrainians will probably have to fall back from fairly soon, because if they don't, they stand a very good risk of becoming encircled. And Netailovo, the fall of Netailovo, also has an important implications for the ongoing battle in Krasnogorovka. I said that all the reports, the reliable reports that I've seen, the plausible reports that I've seen, now say that the Russians have basically gained control of the whole of Krasnogorovka, except for an area to the northwest. There were reports yesterday that the Russians, in fact, control 90% of Krasnogorovka. And yesterday, it appeared that Russian bombing and shelling of the Ukrainian positions in the part of Krasnogorovka which the Ukrainians still control has heavily resumed, and that a Russian attack to clear Krasnogorovka over the next few hours might be underway. Now, another Russian media battlefield reporter Riba claims that there are still some Ukrainian troops, several hundred Ukrainian troops, in the northeastern part of Krasnogorovka. But he says that they are completely encircled and trapped, and it's likely that they will at some point have to surrender or, well, face being killed in battle. I don't know whether that is true or not, but it does seem as if the Russians are about to begin, or perhaps have already begun, what may be the very last major assault in Krasnogorovka before the whole of this town is captured. And lastly, there has been significant news further south in Georgievka. This is the village to the west of Pobieda and Marinka. The Russians have been fighting to capture this village for quite a long time. It's been a difficult village to capture, firstly because it's fairly large, but also there are water barriers around it, there's reservoirs around it. Well, yesterday we got reports that the Russians have now captured practically the whole of Georgievka. Supposedly there's only one building that the Ukrainians still control in this village, but it's expected that they will be pushed out of that village. And if Georgievka is captured, the next village immediately to the west of Georgievka is Maximilionovka. Once the Russians have entered and captured that village, and there are fewer water barriers to protect it, the next settlement immediately to the west is the town of Kharkov, which is of course the place which sits astride the supply lines to the southern fortified town of Vuhledar. So the Russians, on the brink of capturing Krasnogorovka, they've captured Netailovo, they've about to capture Georgievka. There are reports that south of Georgievka, they've reactivated their advance in the Novomikhailivka area. They're now apparently clearing Paraskovievka and are preparing an attack on Konstantinovka. The 79th Brigade, which is still trying to hold positions in this area, they're complaining that with the deployment of one of their battalions to the Kharkov region, there's not enough of them to hold the Russians back, and that they have no reserves. So with Konstantinovka and Paraskovievka captured, Georgievka captured, and Krasnogorovka soon to be captured, and Talevo probably soon to be captured as well. Well, you can see that the net around Kharkov is closing, and of course if the net around Kharkov closes and that town also eventually falls, then the net is also closing around Vuhledar to the south. So that's my overall assessment of the battlefront, of the situation on the Ukrainian battlefronts as of today. I should say that to the extent that there has been a pause, and I've said already that I think that much of the misconception about there having been a pause in the fighting in Ocheretino, Avdiivka, Chasiv Yar and elsewhere is probably simply a product of the attention having been refocused on events in Kharkov. But to the extent to which there has been a slowdown in military operations on the front lines by the Russians, I doubt it is because their troops are exhausted or because they're out of reserves or anything of that kind. I suspect a lot of it is connected to events in Moscow. The change in defense ministers, the summoning by Putin of the top military commanders to Moscow, where he's had a meeting with them, Gerasimov's own participation in these meetings. It has meant that the top people, the chief military commanders, over the last couple of days have been thinking and talking about what's going on in Moscow and have been involved, no doubt, in some of the events that have been taking place there. Now, over the last few hours, they've returned to their headquarters, and having returned to their headquarters, they've been able to again give the necessary orders for further advances, taking advantage of the situations, the local situations which have been created, which is why we have been seeing a significant uptick of Russian military activity over the last 24 hours. Anyway, I've not said anything about Russian drone and missile strikes across Ukraine. I believe that they were quite intense last night. I believe that Kharkov itself was significantly targeted. And of course, rolling blackouts now take place every night across Ukraine. And the Ukrainian energy company Ukr is warning that they will continue and might become more intense as winter approaches. Anyway, that's the overall military situation. Now, there have been some political developments. Firstly, there was a really bizarre article in the New York Times which spoke about concern and alarm within the Biden administration about the Russians having achieved momentum. And this went along with expressions of concern that Ukraine might eventually be forced to accept a Korean-type partition, like the one that ended the Korean War, the kind of division of the country into two parts, even as supposedly there continues to be confidence in the United States that once the latest weapons supplies reach Ukraine, that will enable Ukraine to go back on the offensive and recapture some of the territory, or indeed all of the territory, that the Russians have been able to capture over the last few months. I have to say, based on the situation that I see, this looks all to me completely surreal. Firstly, I don't think that the Ukrainians are going to be able to recapture the territory they have lost. I mean, is it seriously suggested that they're going to be able to recapture Avdiivka, for example? Or if Chasiv Yar falls, which it may do, that they will be able to recapture Chasiv Yar or Krasnogorovka or Marinka? As I said, this looks, to me, completely detached from reality. Besides, if we are talking about the Korean variant, the Russians have already made clear that they are not interested in it. And as they are winning the war, there is really no incentive for them to agree to it either. The Korean variant would have a Ukraine anchored within the Western alliance, re-equipped by the West with new weapons, in a position to take the war to the Russians again. And the Russians have already said that that for them is not acceptable. Putin has just given an interview to Xinhua, the Chinese news agency, in which he has said that if there's going to be peace in Ukraine, it must be tied to a settlement of the overall security situation in Europe. So the Russians are not interested in a Korean settlement. And it's unrealistic to think, also, it seems to me, that events on the battlefield are going to make them change their perspective about this. Putin has also, by the way, said that even if talks over Ukraine do begin, the Russians this time will not agree to any ceasefires. They agreed to ceasefires during the talks with Ukraine in 2022. They even withdrew troops from around Kiev. This is what the Russians always claim, in order to move those negotiations forward. They're not going to make that mistake again, unless and until there is a full, complete, properly signed and sealed agreement with which they are happy. The war, the advance in Ukraine will go on. So, talking about the 1953 armistice in Korea and supposing that this can be reproduced in Ukraine is a fantasy. It's a fantasy. It looked like a fantasy last year when it was basically the proposal that came from Richard Haass and the other people in the Council for Foreign Relations. And it's looking like even more of a fantasy today, given that the Ukrainians have lost so much ground and experienced so many losses over the course of this Russian offensive. The second comment is one that was made by the Czech president, Petr Pavel. Now, he has been something of a hardliner in terms of Ukraine, and of course it was he who came forward with the proposal to buy 800,000 shells on the international arms market. I was always very skeptical about that idea. My understanding is that it has now completely failed, and I suspect that President Pavel's latest comments point firmly in that direction, because he is reported to have said that there is no way for Ukraine to achieve victory. What the priority now should be to end the war, and therefore negotiations have to begin. Now that is different from how he has been talking until recently. Well, we'll see whether President Pavel, perhaps demoralized by his failure to come up with the 800,000 shells that he promised, perhaps this is simply an outburst reflecting his present gloom and pessimism, and then when the others get to him, Ursula von der Leyen and Scholz and all the others, maybe he'll revert to the hardline position that he's taken recently. We'll just have to see. But anyway, for the moment at least, he's talking about the need for negotiations. But even as President Pavel talks about negotiations, and even as some people in the United States are floating the idea of Korean-style partitions and an armistice, we now have another report in the New York Times that the Ukrainians are begging the Americans to send advisors to Ukraine. The US supposedly, for the moment at least, is refusing, but this looks a little, in fact, not a little, it looks so much like that report by Stephen Bryan that I discussed 2 weeks ago, that article in which he spoke about the United States and NATO sending advisors to Ukraine, who, as I pointed out, would actually be special forces troops who would participate in actual military operations. Anyway, it's looking so much like that report, the one by Stephen Bryan, that this report about the Ukrainian request for advisors to be sent, I can't believe that the two are not connected with each other. I am sure that this is information, about the request for the advisors, which is connected in some way with the information that Stephen Bryan was getting from his sources. To be clear, special forces, Western special forces, have always been present in Ukraine. Probably their number is greater now than it has ever been. Quite possibly some of them are indeed engaged in some kind of military activity. The Russians obviously know all about this. If more and more advisors are eventually sent, then we are back on the slippery slope that the United States found itself on in the 1960s in Vietnam, which eventually led all the way to the open and massive deployment of American ground forces to that war, with the consequences which we all know. Anyway, that's Ukraine. Let's now turn to the other big topic of today, even though the two are connected, because of course, one of the most important things to understand is that Putin has been to China with a spring in his step. His army defeated Ukraine's 2023 offensive last year. It has been continuously on the offensive since October. Russia is visibly winning the war, and the Chinese hosted Putin at a time when he looks like a winner. And that is always a good position to be in. So I discussed this visit in previous programs. I pointed out that Putin has gone to China with most of the top people of his government there, Belousov and Shoigu, Lavrov and Ushakov, all of the major economics team, Manturov, the person in overall charge of the economy, Alikhanov, who's now replaced Manturov as the industry minister, Novak, the energy minister, Reshetnikov, the economics minister, Oreshkin, Putin's aide on economic issues, of course, Siluanov, the finance minister, Nabulina, the central bank chair. They've all gone all together to Beijing. But it's also turned out that a massive delegation or group of important Russian business people also joined this delegation. So Oleg Deripaska, the aluminium king, Igor Sechin, the head of Rosneft, the giant state owned oil company, German Gref, once Russia's economics minister, now the chair of Sberbank, Russia's biggest bank, and the bank with which the vast majority of Russians have their accounts, and by the way, from which the vast majority of Russians receive their Mir cards. Kostin, the chair of the other giant bank, VTB, Dmitriev, who runs the Russian Direct Investment Fund, the one that seeks to attract foreign investment into critical sectors of the Russian economy. Michelson, owner and chair of Novatech, major private company. This is an entirely private business, but it's massively involved in liquefied natural gas exports. Shuvalov, head of another bank, VEB, and by the way, Shuvalov was also a minister of the Russian government and for a time also first deputy prime minister in overall charge of the economy. And Alexander Shokhin, a permanent figure within the Russian political system. He's been there. He's been a presence at the very top of the Russian power elite since before the Soviet Union collapsed. Anyway, Shokhin, who is the president of the Russian Union of Industrialists and Entrepreneurs, Russia's biggest business organization by far. So all of these people have been going alongside Putin to Beijing. One notable absence, by the way, and I wonder why he wasn't there, is Miller, who is the head of Gazprom, given that Gazprom has perhaps the biggest projects of all with the Chinese, the Power of Siberia pipelines. I wonder why he wasn't apparently participating in this trip, or perhaps he was. Perhaps it's just that I missed him amongst all of these people who went. For the record, I expect that signatures and completions of the negotiations for the second Power of Siberia pipeline are coming very soon. And of course, Michelson is working on liquefied natural gas exports to Russia, to China, which will take place by sea. But virtually again, all the top people in Russian industry and business, they've also gone to China. And over the course of this meeting, which happened with massive pomp and ceremony, Putin was received at the airport in Beijing by a guard of honor. There were Chinese dignitaries there ready to receive him. A stark contrast from the way in which Secretary of State Blinken was received when he arrived in Beijing about 10 days ago. Anyway, guard of honor for Putin, massive motorcade to bring him to the Great Hall of the People, a hug with President Xi Jinping. Now, can I just say that the Chinese people generally do not do hugs. Such overt demonstrations of affection are not really the sort of thing that is part of Chinese culture. But anyway, it happened this time. A sort of public hug of the two leaders, private meetings between them, and the publication of a gigantic joint statement running to about 8,000 words. I've only seen the Chinese language version, which, since I don't speak Mandarin, I've had to, or read Chinese characters, I've had to read in machine translation, though its essentials are very clear. And anyway, the 8,000 word statement goes into massive detail about the enormous correlation between China and Russia. There's criticisms of the United States, its hegemonic policies, outright rejection of the rules-based international order, a reaffirmation of international law and of the United Nations, a rejection of hegemony, and all of those things associated with the United States. Blame for the present disorders in the world, clearly assigned to the United States and to the West. and an extraordinary list of the various areas where the two countries will cooperate, or rather are cooperating, in virtually every field of economics, science, technology, social programs, what have you. And again, the Chinese and the Russians setting out in this statement that theirs is a relationship that is tried and true, that will last time, that it is not up for negotiation with third parties, that they will trade and develop their relations without any external interference. The Chinese, or perhaps the Chinese and the Russians, agreed to insert in this joint statement an absolutely clear-cut rejection of any plan by anybody in the West to confiscate the sovereign assets of any government. And of course, the government whose assets the West has been contemplating confiscating is the Russian government at the present time. But anyway, an absolute clear-cut rejection of all of this. And, well, it's impossible to avoid the impression, reading this lengthy statement, seeing all of these people who've turned up in Beijing, that this is a relationship that is now at its peak, that it's going to develop, that what we're basically seeing now is the formation of a unified Eurasian space economically, a Eurasian economic space, and that the primary purpose of this visit, as I've said, is for all of these important people to become fully acquainted with each other, with their opposite numbers in each of these countries. All these top Russian people are going to be meeting their equivalents in Beijing. And in the case of people like Kostin, Gref, Sechin, Deripaska, Michelson, well, until recently, most of their international business contacts were with people in the West, but they're now, having seen those contacts crumble, they're going to establish similar contacts with people in China in their place. And I think this is extremely important because even as the two economies are starting to integrate and dovetail with each other, we can see that at the highest level, the elites of the two countries are starting to do the same thing. So one day, once the present crisis is over, once the West fully awakes to the nightmare that they've created, the formation of a Eurasian space, the integration of the Eurasian economies, the enormous economic boom that will result, the growing economic and geopolitical weight of this Eurasian system, one which various intelligent Western figures have been warning about ever since Mackinder in 1904. We did a good program, a very good program on the Duran with Alex Craner, Alex Christoforou and I, a live stream, in fact, in which you can see how Alex Craner discusses this very issue and quotes from what Mackinder was saying about the enormous potential power of Eurasia if it comes together and jointly industrializes. Anyway, Others have warned against this. Brzezinski warned against this. Henry Kissinger warned against this. Henry Kissinger's entire policy, of course, was to try to keep the Chinese and the Russians apart from each other and put the United States in a position where it could triangulate with the other two. Well, what's happening is all of these worst nightmares of Mackinder, Brzezinski, Kissinger, and so many others are now starting to come to happen. And as I said, one day, when Western leaders finally understand that, and when they perhaps say to themselves that losing Russia was a catastrophic mistake, and that they need to re-establish contacts with the Russians and need to try to pull the Russians back towards Europe and away and the West and away from the Chinese, they will find that the moment to do that has gone, because putting aside the trading and economic and political and, by the way, military links, the joint statement also refers to military links, putting aside all of these links, all of these people, all of the elites, the Chinese elite, the Russian elite, will have become so familiar with each other, so accustomed to working together with each other, they will know each other so well that it will seem for business people in Moscow as natural for them to do their business in China today as it was 20 years ago for them to do their business in Europe, so that when the Europeans come back, the Europeans will be strange to them, whereas the Chinese will not. So this is going to be a huge cultural shift, as well as everything else. Well, there it is. It has come to pass. I don't think it's remotely reversible now. I think the West will have to try to adapt itself to it. The fact that soon the Russians will be dominant in Ukraine will, of course, only consolidate further these tendencies. But anyway, it seems to me that these errors in Western policy, these attempts, as the Chinese and the Russians mention in their joint statement, to contain simultaneously both of them, they've now consolidated this Chinese-Russian partnership and made it open. And it has happened despite the fact that the West has long understood that this is the greatest danger to its dominance in itself. We're now seeing the price of neocon policies. At least the West now is seeing the price of neocon policies. Russian-Chinese relations would have become very good one way or the other, even if relations between Russia and the West had remained very good, even if relations between China and the West had remained very good. There would nonetheless have been a coming together of the Chinese and the Russians. There was no logic to their confrontation in the 1960s. We now know that one of the Soviet officials who always made that point was the Soviet Prime Minister of that period, Alexei Kosygin, the person who was the political patron of Belousov's father. Perhaps Belousov knew him himself, just saying. Anyway, there was always, sooner or later, going to be a rapprochement between the Chinese and the Russians. But it didn't follow that it would develop into this system that we see emerge today, an actual unified Eurasian space with the Chinese and the Russians working on building it up together. And by the way, I notice that they're persisting in some of the projects that many in the West comforted themselves with thinking that they'd been shelved. They're pressing forward, despite claims to the contrary, with development of their big, wide-bodied transport aircraft, their heavy-lift helicopter. The Russians have made it absolutely clear that they are fully involved in both of those projects, despite Western claims to the contrary. Anyway, it didn't have to be this way. You could have had a Russia that was friendly and a China that was friendly with the West, even as they were friendly with each other. But now you have a West which is the adversary of an emerging Eurasian colossus. This is what neocon policies have brought about. And I'm just going to finish with one last thought. Over the last couple of weeks, we've seen repeated attempts by Western leaders, Western governments, to try to influence Beijing in some way. We've had visits to Beijing by Secretary of the Treasury Janet Yellen, Secretary of State Tony Blinken. We've had a very fraught meeting in France between President Macron of France and Ursula von der Leyen on the one hand and Xi Jinping on the other. And all of these leaders have been trying to get the Chinese to stop exporting dual-use goods, as they call them, to Russia. And if my own assessment of that Financial Times article by Martin Sandbu is correct, trying to get the Chinese to provide tacit agreement to the West's confiscation of Russia's sovereign assets. Well, even as all of these Western leaders were coming to Beijing or talking to Xi Jinping with these proposals, the Chinese would have been working with the Russians on that joint statement. It wouldn't have been written. 8,000 words of a statement like this are not written up in 2 days. The Chinese and the Russians have probably been working on this document for a very long time, probably ever since Xi Jinping's visit to Moscow in March of last year. And of course, all of these other projects that the Russians and the Chinese have ongoing with each other, they will have been worked on and discussed and debated and developed over the same period, at least a year. So even as the Chinese meet with Biden in San Francisco at the San Francisco summit, even as they listen to Secretary Blinken and Secretary Yellen and to Macron and Scholz and Ursula von der Leyen and all of that, well, they carry on doing quietly that which they always said they would do: forge ever closer relations with the Russians and telling the Europeans and the Americans basically to get lost. And now they haven't just told the Europeans and the Americans to get lost. They've basically stuck 2 fingers up with this joint declaration that we've just seen in Beijing. Altogether, the neocons in the United States have done a brilliant job of uniting all of America's adversaries against the United States, forging de facto alliances between them and transforming them from adversaries into enemies. Truly outstanding statesmanship in every respect. Well, this is where I finish. There'll be more from me soon. Let me remind you again that you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. Don't forget also that you can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar. Links under this video. You can also check out our shop. Get yourself the amazing things you will find there. Magic mugs, hats, hoodies, t-shirts, sweatshirts, all those great things. And of course, last but not least, don't forget, if you like this video, to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.